The courtroom was filled with the usual hum of anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers, murmuring quietly to their colleagues, while the occasional clink of the bailiff's gavel echoed through the room. The case before the court was an important one, a high-profile lawsuit involving a renowned celebrity and a powerful media corporation. Yet, the tension in the room had less to do with the case and more to do with the unusual presence of a certain figure. At first glance, Clint Eastwood seemed out of place in the courtroom. The man who had once been the epitome of the tough, silent anti-hero in films like Dirty Harry and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly now sat across from a table filled with lawyers, all impeccably dressed in their suits. Clint, on the other hand, looked unbothered in his signature gray blazer, appearing more like an actor at a press conference than a legal mastermind. He had always been known for his stoic demeanor on screen, and today, he wore that same calm expression, as if nothing about the situation was unfamiliar. The lawyers in the room had heard the rumors, of course. Clint Eastwood had passed the bar exam years ago and had occasionally dipped his toes into the world of law, but most saw him as a celebrity with little more than a superficial understanding of the legal world. But today, Clint wasn't in the courtroom for a cameo appearance. No, this was very real. And his entrance had sent ripples of disbelief through the legal community. The judge, a seasoned professional named Judge Thompson, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. He had heard the stories about Clint Eastwood's legal ambitions, but like everyone else, he couldn't shake the image of the grizzled actor. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Thompson began with a hint of a smirk, "I trust you're prepared for today's proceedings." Clint didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his eyes never leaving the judge's gaze. "I'm prepared, Your Honor." The moment hung in the air, thick with the irony that the judge was about to face someone who was both a Hollywood icon and a legal wildcard. Most of the people present in the courtroom had their doubts about Clint's abilities. Sure, he had the star power, but could a man who spent most of his life on movie sets really hold his own in the cutthroat world of law? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. The courtroom's unofficial onlookers seemed to suggest, their eyes glued to the spectacle unfolding in front of them. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As Clint sat in silence, he could feel the weight of skepticism around him. His presence alone was enough to make people question whether this trial could really be taken seriously. But beneath that cool exterior, Clint was no stranger to pressure. In fact, he thrived under it. When the opposing lawyer, a young but experienced litigator named David Carter, stood to address the court, Clint's eyes sharpened. David had been known for his aggressive tactics and quick wit, often leaving opponents scrambling to keep up. His reputation preceded him, and many were curious to see how Clint would fare against such an opponent. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice smooth and calculated. "Today, we are here not just to address the matter at hand but to set a precedent. We all know the value of reputation in the court of public opinion, and unfortunately, it seems we have a defendant who has allowed their celebrity to overshadow their responsibilities." David's gaze flicked over to Clint, and the corners of his lips curled into a slight, almost condescending smile. "I'm sure Mr. Eastwood has plenty of experience with press conferences and the big screen, but this isn't a film. We're dealing with real lives here, with real consequences." The tension in the room mounted. Clint didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of the table. He wasn't fazed by David's words. He knew that the courtroom could be as unpredictable as the Wild West. Just as in any film, the hero had to navigate his way through obstacles, and Clint wasn't going to back down now. Judge Thompson, sensing the growing unease, called the court to order. "Mr. Carter, you may proceed with your opening statement." David's voice echoed as he outlined the case's complexities, bringing in legal jargon and references to previous cases. But even as he spoke, Clint felt the weight of the situation begin to shift. The courtroom, with all its formalities, felt strangely familiar to him. Perhaps it was the intensity of the moment. Or maybe it was the challenge that stirred something deep within him, just like the many challenges his characters had faced on screen. As the session continued, Clint's mind wandered back to his own history with the law. Years ago, during a break from his acting career, Clint had found himself drawn to the study of law. He'd always had a fascination with justice, with the idea that the law wasn't just a set of rules but a means to bring about real change. It had started as a hobby, something to keep his mind engaged between film projects. But over time, Clint had grown more serious about it, taking the necessary steps to earn his law degree. But it wasn't just about legal knowledge for Clint. It was about understanding people. It was about understanding what made them tick and how the law could either help or hurt them. It was about seeking justice, no matter how many obstacles stood in his way. The day Clint passed the bar exam was one of the proudest moments of his life. He had done it not for fame or fortune, but because he believed in the power of the law. And now, as he sat in this courtroom, he had a chance to prove that his understanding of justice wasn't limited to his movie roles. As the session broke for a short recess, Clint stood and stretched. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, scrutinizing his every move. But Clint was unfazed. He had faced larger crowds, harsher critics, and tougher odds in his career. This was just another challenge, and he was ready to take it on. David Carter, who had been watching him closely, approached Clint during the break. "I have to admit, I didn't expect you to be here today," he said, his tone still polite but tinged with disbelief. "Are you really prepared for what's ahead?" Clint's eyes locked with David's, and for the first time, a hint of a smile crossed his face. "You'd be surprised what I'm capable of, Mr. Carter. And I'll show you just how well prepared I am." David raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. The game was on. And Clint Eastwood, the man who had spent a lifetime playing tough guys on screen, was about to show the world just how sharp his mind could be in the courtroom. The gavel would soon strike again, and the real battle would begin. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood had never been one to talk much about his past, especially not the details that had led him to where he was today. Most people only saw him as the grizzled, silver-haired actor who played tough, no-nonsense characters. They didn't see the quiet man behind the screen, the one who had spent countless hours studying law, crafting strategies, and developing a deep understanding of justice. Growing up in a small town in California, Clint's childhood had been anything but glamorous. His family wasn't poor, but they certainly weren't wealthy. They lived in a modest home, and his father, a steelworker, worked long hours to provide for the family. Clint's mother, on the other hand, was a teacher who instilled in him a strong sense of discipline and the value of hard work. From a young age, Clint had always been drawn to things that required focus and precision. He was the kid who spent hours perfecting his basketball shots in the driveway or training with the neighborhood kids to improve his baseball swing. His early life wasn't easy, but it was grounded in one principle: if you worked hard enough, you could overcome anything. But it wasn't just sports that Clint was drawn to. Even as a teenager, he found himself fascinated by the concept of law and order. His high school years had been marked by a quiet obsession with the judicial system. He devoured books about criminal justice, legal history, and the foundational principles of American law. His best friend, Sam, had often teased him for spending more time reading legal texts than hanging out with the guys, but Clint didn't mind. He had always felt a deep, almost instinctual pull toward justice. It wasn't long before Clint realized that his future might not lie in sports or academics. At 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, where he worked as a swimming instructor. This period of his life proved to be a turning point in more ways than one. Clint learned to navigate both the complexities of military structure and the weight of leadership. He saw firsthand how rules, whether in the army or in life, could be both a tool for good and a weapon for control. It was in the army that Clint first began to develop the leadership qualities that would later shape his career, both on and off the screen. After his service, Clint moved to Los Angeles, hoping to find success as an actor. He had no formal training, no connections in the industry, and no clear idea of how to break into the business. All he had was a strong sense of self-discipline and a relentless determination to succeed. For a time, Clint struggled to find his footing. He appeared in a few minor television roles, but his big break didn't come until 1955 when he landed the part of Rowdy Yates on the hit TV show Rawhide. It was a role that would mark the beginning of his legendary career. But what most people didn't know about Clint during those early years was that he wasn't just working on his acting skills. Between filming, Clint continued to study law in his free time, reading casebooks and immersing himself in legal theory. He wasn't satisfied just being a Hollywood star, he wanted to understand the world in a deeper way. His years in the entertainment industry had exposed him to the flaws of the system, the corruption in the media, and the way public perception often didn't align with the truth. The desire to seek out truth and to understand the mechanisms of justice burned deeply within him. By the 1970s, Clint had established himself as a major film star, with iconic roles in movies like Dirty Harry and The Outlaw Josie Wales. However, his time on the big screen wasn't merely a distraction from law, it was a way for him to develop his understanding of human nature. He played characters who navigated morally gray areas, characters who were forced to reconcile their personal beliefs with their actions. In many ways, these roles served as a training ground for Clint's future in law. After decades in Hollywood, Clint's interest in law grew beyond personal curiosity. He wanted to give something back. The more he studied, the more he realized that there was an entire world of legal battles that most people never saw. A world where those without power were often at the mercy of those who could afford the best lawyers. He wasn't satisfied with just being a passive observer in that world. He wanted to be an active participant. And so, Clint did the unthinkable. He enrolled in law school, not just as a hobby or side project but as a serious pursuit. He spent late nights poring over legal textbooks, attending classes, and engaging with professors. He passed the bar exam with flying colors, shocking many of his critics. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a Hollywood star, he was now a licensed attorney. In the years that followed, Clint used his legal knowledge to work on various pro bono cases. He didn't seek the fame or attention that came with being a lawyer, he did it because he believed in the value of justice. Clint didn't need the spotlight, but he often found himself in situations where his dual identity as both a public figure and a legal professional came into play. People began to respect his legal acumen, even if they remained skeptical of his ability to juggle the complexities of a courtroom while maintaining his star status. As Clint sat in the courtroom on this fateful day, he could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him. He wasn't just here as Clint Eastwood, the actor. He was here as Clint Eastwood, the lawyer, someone who had spent years honing his legal skills and preparing for this moment. And yet, the courtroom remained a strange place for Clint. There was a peculiar kind of dissonance between the man who had fought for justice on the silver screen and the man who now sought it in real life. He knew that this wasn't a movie. This wasn't a role he was playing. It was real. Lives were at stake. The pressure was undeniable, but Clint had always thrived under pressure. Across from him, David Carter, the opposing attorney, was still running his mouth. But Clint's mind wasn't on him. He was thinking about what came next, the strategies he'd use, the moves he'd make. He could already see the flaws in David's arguments, the cracks in his case. It wasn't going to be easy, but Clint Eastwood wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge's voice broke through Clint's thoughts. "Your turn to present your opening statement." Clint stood up, his back straight and his face as stoic as ever. The room fell silent. This was it. The moment where he would make his mark, not just as an actor, but as a legal mind. With a calm but commanding voice, Clint began, "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, I stand before you today not just as a man who has spent a lifetime studying human nature, but as someone who believes in the principles of fairness, integrity, and justice. The words came naturally, like an actor delivering his lines. But this time, Clint wasn't playing a character. This was his story. And the world would soon learn that Clint Eastwood, the actor, was nothing compared to Clint Eastwood, the lawyer. Clint Eastwood's words reverberated through the courtroom. His voice, steady and firm, held the room in rapt attention. It wasn't the deep, gravelly tone that people had come to expect from his characters in movies, it was a voice that commanded respect. Clint wasn't playing the tough guy today, he was using something far more potent, his mind. His presence in the courtroom was no longer just that of a celebrity, it was that of a legal professional. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Clint began, his gaze sweeping across the room. This case is not just about a celebrity or a corporation. This is about something much more fundamental, the pursuit of truth, the protection of fairness, and the right to be heard. We are not here for a popularity contest, and we are not here to entertain the masses. We are here to ensure that justice is served. There was a pause, a moment where Clint allowed his words to settle in the minds of those present. He wasn't in a rush. This was the kind of thing he had always understood, timing was everything. His eyes briefly flicked to David Carter, who was sitting across the aisle, his expression one of quiet disbelief. Clint could sense David's uncertainty. It wasn't just that Clint was a famous actor, it was that Clint was here, in this space, and commanding respect in a way that few could. David had initially thought he could dismiss Clint as a celebrity lawyer, someone who might throw around flashy arguments but would ultimately crumble under the weight of legal intricacies. But now, after hearing Clint's opening words, he wasn't so sure. Clint continued, his voice unwavering. We are here because the defendant, a media giant, has taken it upon themselves to ruin the reputation of an individual with nothing more than sensationalist headlines and fabricated stories. The truth has been twisted, and the damage caused is irreparable. It is time for the court to stand for what is right, not what is popular. We seek the truth, and we seek justice. The courtroom fell into a silence that was palpable. Clint's words were precise, and the clarity of his arguments was undeniable. There was no bravado, no grandstanding, just the simple, unwavering assertion that the legal system existed to protect truth and fairness. Judge Thompson adjusted his glasses, leaning forward slightly. Mr. Eastwood, your opening statement is noted. Mr. Carter, your response. David Carter stood slowly, his well-tailored suit almost as polished as his demeanor. He was clearly unsettled by Clint's eloquence, but he wasn't one to back down easily. He took a deep breath, adjusting his tie before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what Mr. Eastwood just presented to you may sound noble, even righteous, David began, his voice smooth and calculated. But this case is not as simple as he would have you believe. We are dealing with the world of celebrity, where public perception can make or break an individual. What my client did was not an attack on personal character, but rather a response to a larger issue, the public's right to know. Clint watched as David continued with his speech, laying out a framework of legal principles that he knew would be used to justify the media company's actions. The case, at its core, was about the balance between an individual's right to privacy and the media's right to report. It was a classic David versus Goliath story, but this time, Clint wasn't playing the underdog. He was the giant. David's argument hinged on the idea that the media had a responsibility to expose the truth, no matter the cost. He painted the plaintiff as a public figure who had courted attention and who could not claim the same protections as an ordinary citizen. It was a smart argument, one that would resonate with many, but Clint had something David didn't, years of experience navigating human nature. Clint knew that the jury wouldn't be swayed by glossy words and polished rhetoric. They wanted substance. As David finished his statement, Clint stood once again, his presence undeniable. He wasn't about to let David define the narrative. This was his courtroom now. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clint said, his voice once again commanding attention. "We are not talking about the right to report. We are not talking about the right to expose. We are talking about the right to protect someone's dignity and their reputation. My client did not ask to be torn apart by the media. My client did not ask for the world to judge them based on a series of half-truths and distortions." He turned slightly, addressing the jury directly now. "Imagine, if you will, being in my client's shoes. Your life is turned upside down. Your character is questioned by people who don't know you, and worse, by people who never cared to understand you in the first place. How would you feel? What would you do?" Clint allowed the question to linger, his eyes scanning the faces of the jury. He could see their expressions change subtly, some of them nodding, others leaning forward. He had done his job. He had planted the seed of doubt, the question of fairness, and the reminder that what the media had done was not a reflection of the truth. His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Clint allowed himself a quiet smile. It wasn't out of arrogance, it was the smile of a man who had been in countless situations where he knew how to control the room. He wasn't an actor here. He was a lawyer. And in this moment, he was in full command. The judge nodded slowly, signaling for the proceedings to continue. "We will now hear from the first witness," Judge Thompson said, and the tension in the room thickened. Clint took a seat, his mind already shifting gears. The real work was about to begin. He had to make his case, and he had to make it stick. David Carter would not go down without a fight, and Clint expected nothing less. But what David didn't understand yet was that Clint was no stranger to battles. Whether it was on a movie set or in a courtroom, Clint Eastwood always knew how to win the war. As the first witness took the stand, Clint's focus sharpened. He had been preparing for this moment for years, studying the law with the same intensity that he had once devoted to mastering a role. He wasn't just here to play a part, he was here to win. And with that, the courtroom drama began to unfold. But Clint was ready. The battlefield had been set, and Clint Eastwood wasn't about to lose. The courtroom had grown tense, the air thick with anticipation as the first witness approached the stand. It was now Clint's time to carefully navigate through the details, to look for any slip-up, any sign of weakness that could tip the case in his favor. Every part of him was focused, his mind working quickly, piecing together the strategy he had spent years refining. The witness, a journalist who had written the offending article, was about to give the first of many testimonies that would define the outcome of this case. The man who took the stand was not unfamiliar to Clint. Richard Grayson was a seasoned reporter for the Times, known for his hard-hitting stories and ability to get the inside scoop on high-profile individuals. Grayson had a reputation for getting results, no matter what it took. But Clint could already see the cracks in his story. Grayson wasn't the innocent truth-teller he made himself out to be. His reputation was built on sensationalism, not journalistic integrity. The defense attorney, David Carter, stood and began his questioning. "Mr. Grayson," he started, his tone smooth and controlled, "can you tell the court why you chose to write the article in question?" Grayson adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began, "Certainly. As a journalist, it's my job to report the truth. I had received credible sources that revealed certain details about the plaintiff's personal life, details that the public had a right to know. I did what any journalist would do, I reported the facts." Clint's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched Grayson carefully. The man's words sounded rehearsed, too perfect. Clint knew this was the kind of argument that would appeal to the public. The idea of the truth being published, no matter how invasive, would resonate with many. But Clint wasn't buying it. He had been in the business of truth-seeking for years, and he knew when something didn't smell right. David Carter continued, pressing Grayson, "And did you verify these credible sources before writing the article?" Grayson hesitated for a moment, and Clint's instincts flared. This was the moment. The witness was about to crack, and Clint knew it. "Well, I I had corroborating information from several different people in the industry, Grayson said, but his voice wavered. I didn't have the exact details, but I had enough evidence to justify publishing. Clint could hear the uncertainty in Grayson's voice now, and he knew that the cracks were starting to show. This was Clint's opening. Your Honor, may I? Clint's voice rang out across the courtroom, cutting through the tension. Judge Thompson looked up from his papers, his tired eyes meeting Clint's. You may proceed, Mr. Eastwood. Clint stood slowly, walking toward the witness stand with deliberate calm. Every step was measured, his presence filling the space between him and Grayson. He was a man who had spent a lifetime on both sides of the lens, both in front of the camera and behind it. He knew how to handle people, how to make them unravel with just a few words. And that's exactly what he intended to do now. He turned to Grayson, his voice steady but sharp. Mr. Grayson, you say you had credible sources, but you also admitted that you didn't have the exact details. Isn't it true that the information you published was based on hearsay and speculation? Grayson squirmed in his seat, the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. I had reason to believe that the sources were reliable, he stammered. Clint leaned in, his gaze piercing. But you didn't verify the facts. You chose to publish an article that, quite frankly, has damaged my client's life beyond repair. And for what? A story that you couldn't even back up with hard evidence. The courtroom was silent. The weight of Clint's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Grayson looked flustered now, and Clint could see that the journalist was starting to lose his composure. You took a gamble with someone's life, Clint continued, his voice lowering. And that gamble wasn't about truth. It was about selling a story. You knew the damage you could cause, but you published it anyway. Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but the words failed him. Clint turned back to the jury, addressing them now, his tone shifting to something more somber, more reflective. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not about a simple case of misinformation. This is about an individual being vilified in the public eye without due process, without verification. This is about the destructive power of unfounded claims and the irreparable harm they cause. Clint paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. He could feel the jury's eyes on him, their silent judgment weighing heavily in the balance. Mr. Grayson didn't care about the truth when he published that article. He cared about one thing, getting the story out there first. The consequences of that decision were never his to bear. But today, we are here to make sure that the consequences of his actions are felt. This is not just about one person's reputation. This is about accountability in the media, and it starts with this case. Clint could see the jury members shifting in their seats, some nodding as if his words had found their mark. Grayson, on the other hand, had lost all sense of authority. The room had shifted. Clint had expertly turned the tide in his favor, and he knew that the damage to the journalist's credibility was done. Judge Thompson looked over at David Carter, who seemed to be weighing his next move. Carter hadn't expected Clint to come out so forcefully, so decisively. It was clear that Clint wasn't just going to let this case unfold, he was going to control the narrative, every step of the way. Clint returned to his seat, the quiet sense of satisfaction filling him. He had delivered his point, and now it was time to let the jury reflect on what had been said. The battle was far from over, but with each passing moment, Clint Eastwood was gaining ground. As the witness was excused from the stand and the courtroom prepared for the next phase of the trial, Clint allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. This wasn't just about winning, it was about something more. It was about the right to protect the truth, to seek justice in a world where the line between fact and fiction often became blurred. And Clint knew that, no matter how hard this journey got, he was ready. He had faced down the impossible before. This time, he wasn't just fighting for a role, he was fighting for something far more important, the restoration of justice. The days that followed were a blur of witnesses, testimonies, and intense cross-examinations. Clint had already won the first round, but he knew that the road ahead would be much tougher. The media's defense was built on a well-oiled machine of high-powered attorneys and public relations strategies. Yet Clint's resolve remained unshaken. Every day in court, he fought not only for his client but for the broader principle of fairness in an age where the truth was too often twisted to fit an agenda. Clint stood outside the courtroom that evening, his fingers tapping idly against the steel railing. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the busy street. His mind was still buzzing from the day's session. The witness testimonies had been expected, each one trying to spin the narrative in the media company's favor. But Clint wasn't ready to accept anything at face value. He needed to dig deeper, expose the layers of manipulation hiding beneath the surface. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he answered without hesitation. Clint. The voice on the other end was familiar, calm, and a little too controlled. Yeah, what's up? Clint responded, his voice steady. It's Veronica, she said, her tone all business. I've been going over the articles again, especially the ones from Grayson. There's something off, Clint. The sources he quoted in the article, the ones that supposedly gave him all that insider information, they're untraceable. No one can confirm them. I've checked with several other reporters, and they've never heard of these so-called whistleblowers. It's a red flag. Clint leaned against the railing, the gravity of her words sinking in. So, the whole thing's a fabrication? Not exactly. It's more like a selective truth, Veronica said, her voice sharp. Grayson used some truth to back up his story, but he cherry-picked and exaggerated details. The problem is that he made it sound like a revelation when it was just a poorly pieced-together rumor. Clint took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was the break he had been waiting for. If he could expose the media giant for fabricating their sources, it would be a game-changer. He knew that getting this information to the jury at the right moment would be crucial. But the timing had to be perfect. You've done great work, Veronica, Clint said, a sense of urgency creeping into his voice. But we need to hit them hard with this. I'll need a full report, and we have to figure out a way to present it in court. The jury needs to know they've been lied to. I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning, she replied, her voice laced with determination. We're close, Clint. Really close. He hung up the phone, his mind set on the task ahead. There was no room for error now. This case wasn't just a trial, it was a fight for the truth. And Clint Eastwood was determined to win. The following day, Clint entered the courtroom with a quiet intensity. The battle of words would soon give way to the presentation of evidence. The moment the jury saw the truth laid bare before them, it would all come together. The question was whether the media giant's defense could survive the weight of their own lies. As Clint settled into his seat, his attorney's instincts kicked in. He could feel the tension in the air, the pressure mounting as the next witness was called. The witness was another journalist, this time, someone who had allegedly worked with Grayson on an earlier piece about the plaintiff. Clint had been briefed on her background, but he hadn't expected the surprise that awaited him. The woman who walked to the stand was young, mid-30s, with a sharp look in her eyes and a quiet demeanor that seemed at odds with the ferocity Clint knew she was capable of. Her name was Rebecca Moore, a rising star in the investigative journalism world. According to the prosecution, she had been the one who had originally uncovered information about the plaintiff's past, information that had fueled the now infamous article. But Clint wasn't convinced. He could see the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. There was something she wasn't telling. Ms. Moore, David Carter began, his voice smooth and polished, can you tell us about your involvement with the article regarding the plaintiff? Rebecca took a moment before responding, her voice measured. I was tasked with investigating a lead about the plaintiff's past. I didn't know the full story, but the lead seemed credible. The publication needed a strong story, and I was the one who brought the information to the table. Clint leaned forward slightly, watching her carefully. It was exactly what he expected, a routine answer that suggested she was just doing her job. But Clint knew better. There was more to it. David Carter continued, and when you received the information, did you verify its credibility? Did you check with other sources to ensure the facts were accurate before passing it on? Rebecca hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. I did the best I could with the information I had, she said, her voice faltering just slightly. The sources were well placed, and I trusted them. Clint could feel it, this wasn't a clear-cut case of journalistic integrity. There were holes in her story, and he was ready to expose them. Ms. Moore, Clint said, rising from his seat with his usual calm, are you telling this court that you trusted these sources without verifying them? That you published damaging information without fully understanding its accuracy? Rebecca's eyes flickered nervously, and she quickly regained composure, though her voice trembled slightly as she replied, I didn't think it was necessary at the time. The information was, it seemed reliable. Clint stepped closer to the stand, his presence overwhelming as he addressed the jury directly. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we're hearing here is a story of negligence. Ms. Moore didn't take the time to verify her sources, and as a result, my client was dragged through the mud. This wasn't just a simple mistake, it was a careless disregard for the truth. He turned back to Rebecca. You may have trusted these sources, Ms. Moore, but you failed to do your job properly. You published something that was not only inaccurate but harmful. And now we're here, trying to undo the damage that you and your colleagues caused. Rebecca's face flushed, but she said nothing. Clint knew she wouldn't admit to the full extent of her role. But that didn't matter, he had made his point. The jury was listening, and the cracks in the defense's armor were becoming more visible. Clint returned to his seat, a quiet confidence settling over him. The tides were turning. The defense's case was built on half-truths and shoddy journalism, and he had just begun to expose it. It was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light, and Clint Eastwood was going to make sure of it. As the court adjourned for the day, Clint gathered his things and made his way toward the exit. He didn't feel the usual rush of excitement that came after a victorious moment. This was far from over. But he could feel the momentum shifting in his favor, and that was enough. The battle was still fierce, but Clint was prepared for whatever came next. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new twists. But Clint Eastwood was ready for the fight. He always had been. The courtroom buzzed with activity the next morning, the air thick with anticipation as the second round of testimonies was set to begin. Clint sat at the defense table, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail, every subtle shift in the atmosphere. He had known that this case would be a long one, but each day felt like it was pushing him closer to the edge. The evidence he had been collecting, the moments of brilliance in cross-examinations, they were all building towards something big. And today, Clint could feel that something was about to unfold. Clint's assistant, Veronica, had worked late into the night, piecing together the final details of the story. She had uncovered information that would shake the very foundation of the prosecution's case. He had to time this perfectly. Today, he planned to introduce a new piece of evidence, something that would change everything. The sound of the courtroom door creaking open brought Clint out of his thoughts. David Carter, the opposing attorney, entered first, followed by the witness for the day, a senior editor from the Times named Rachel Thompson. She was poised and confident, dressed in an expensive, tailored suit that matched her professional demeanor. Clint had read her file thoroughly, she was known for her sharp editorial skills and close relationship with Grayson. But Clint was already thinking ahead. He wasn't going to let her smooth testimony slip by unnoticed. He would find the inconsistencies, the gaps, and expose them. Judge Thompson called the session to order, and everyone stood in respect. Once they sat, the questioning began. Ms. Thompson, David Carter said smoothly, can you explain to this court your role in the publication of the article written by Mr. Grayson? Rachel straightened up in her seat, preparing herself to answer. Yes, Mr. Carter. I oversee the editorial process at the Times. When Mr. Grayson brought the story to me, I reviewed it thoroughly before it went to print. We ensure that everything we publish is factual, well-researched, and meets the journalistic standards of the paper. In this case, we believe the information was sound, and it was published after careful consideration. Clint narrowed his eyes. Everything she was saying was standard editorial protocol, but Clint knew that a lot of those protocols had been bypassed in this case. This was just the first layer of the defense's carefully crafted narrative. And Clint was ready to peel it back. "You reviewed this article, Ms. Thompson," Clint interjected, his voice calm but precise. "Did you personally verify the sources that Mr. Grayson used before it went to print?" Rachel hesitated, just for a second, but Clint caught it. "I did not personally verify every source, no," she admitted, her voice steady. "However, the sources Grayson used were reputable. As the senior editor, I trusted his judgment." Clint leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "So, you didn't do your due diligence. You didn't question the reliability of the sources. You simply trusted that everything was correct?" Rachel's expression shifted, her calm demeanor starting to crack. "I trusted that Grayson did his job properly." Clint could feel the tension rise in the room. The more Rachel spoke, the more the foundation of their case seemed to erode. It was a simple admission, but it spoke volumes. Trusting someone's judgment was fine, unless that trust led to a catastrophe. And Clint knew that the article Grayson had written was the catalyst for a cascade of damage that no one could take back. "You've admitted that you didn't do your own verification. And you're also implying that Grayson's sources were reputable. But, as we know, not one of those sources can be traced back to a legitimate individual," Clint said, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a razor. "Ms. Thompson, would you say that the Times takes pride in publishing articles based on what can only be described as unverified rumor?" Rachel's eyes widened at the implication. Her composure wavered, but she quickly regained her bearings. "That's not what I'm implying, Mr. Eastwood. We have editorial standards that are highly respected, and we believe in what we publish. The article was based on the information we had at the time." Clint wasn't about to let her skirt around the issue. He knew exactly what he had to do. "The problem with that, Ms. Thompson," Clint began, his voice lowering to a controlled intensity, "is that when the Times publishes an article of this magnitude, it's no longer just a matter of what we had at the time. You see, the article not only attacked the integrity of my client, it did so based on information that could not withstand even the slightest scrutiny. This isn't about the standards you claim to uphold. This is about the consequences of spreading misinformation." Rachel swallowed hard, her grip on the edge of the witness stand tightening. Clint continued, "So, tell me, Ms. Thompson, what would have happened if you had taken the extra step to verify Grayson's story? What if you had questioned the reliability of these sources before publishing? Would we be here today, trying to repair the damage that the Times has caused?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence in the room. Rachel's face was flushed with tension. She knew the answer all too well. If they had checked their sources, if they had done their job properly, none of this would have happened. But Clint wasn't done yet. "You see, Ms. Thompson, it's not just about getting the story out there first. It's about taking responsibility for what you put into the world. And when you don't take that responsibility seriously, people's lives are affected." Rachel blinked, her eyes avoiding Clint's gaze for a moment. She looked like she had been caught in a web she couldn't escape. But that wasn't Clint's concern. His concern was what came next. As the defense rested their case, Clint knew that the next move was his. Veronica had delivered the evidence they had been waiting for, evidence that would expose the full extent of the defense's negligence. Clint stood, his voice low but firm, addressing the jury one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard today from people who were supposed to do their jobs, people who were responsible for ensuring the truth was told. But what you've heard today isn't truth. What you've heard is a narrative built on half-truths and assumptions. This case isn't about winning or losing a simple lawsuit. This case is about accountability. The question you must ask yourselves is not just who was right or wrong, but who will be held accountable for the actions that have led us here today. Clint's words echoed through the courtroom as he took his seat. He knew the battle was far from over. But the tides had changed. His strategy had worked. The jury was listening. And the truth was beginning to rise to the surface, ready to be revealed. As the session adjourned for the day, Clint allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The pressure had mounted, but he was certain of one thing: he was closer to victory. The next step would be crucial, revealing the evidence that would bring it all crashing down. The truth was on Clint Eastwood's side. And no amount of spin from the Times could stop it. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long beams of light across the room. Clint sat in his chair, fingers steepled in front of his face as he pondered the day ahead. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he knew it was necessary. This would be the turning point of the case, the moment that would tip the scales in his favor. Everything had been carefully planned, every detail accounted for. Now, it was time to pull the trigger. The defense's case had already been laid out, and the pieces of their narrative were coming apart. But Clint had been waiting for this moment, the moment when he could lay out the full extent of the media giant's negligence. The evidence had been gathered, scrutinized, and polished for just this day. David Carter, the opposing attorney, entered the courtroom with his usual confident stride. He exchanged a few words with his colleagues before taking his seat. He didn't know it yet, but his team was about to be blindsided. Clint could sense it in the air: today would not go as planned for them. The courtroom was silent as the full weight of Jessica's testimony settled over everyone. Clint allowed the gravity of her words to sink in before he continued. "Ms. Marks," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness, "can you explain how you were able to verify that these sources did not exist?" Jessica nodded. "I conducted extensive interviews with several people who were supposed to be the sources of the information. None of them could corroborate the details that were published. Some of the names were completely fabricated. I also found records that showed the sources had no professional background or involvement in the matters described in the article." Clint turned to face the jury, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are hearing is a direct admission that the Times, a publication that prides itself on journalistic integrity, has published a story based on completely fabricated sources. The so-called whistleblowers never existed. The plaintiff's life was torn apart by a story built on lies." There was a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom, but Clint pressed on. "Jessica Marks isn't the only one who uncovered the truth," Clint continued. "We have independent records, interviews, and verification from other sources that back up her claims. The Times didn't just fail to do their due diligence, they actively participated in a campaign of deception. And now we are left here, with a man's reputation in ruins, all because of a story that should have never been published." Clint turned to face the judge, his voice still calm but full of conviction. "Your Honor, we are prepared to submit this evidence into the record. This information, along with the testimony of Ms. Marks, will show the jury beyond a doubt that the actions of the defense were not only negligent but malicious." Judge Thompson nodded slowly. "I will allow this evidence to be entered into the record. We will take a short recess to allow the jury to review the materials." Clint sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. He knew that this was the moment of truth. The evidence had been presented, the lies exposed, and the defense was in full retreat. But even with everything in his favor, Clint knew that the real battle was still ahead. The defense would fight tooth and nail to protect their reputation, and the case was far from won. But for the first time in this long and exhausting battle, Clint allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had the truth on his side. And no matter what happened next, he knew he had given it everything. As the courtroom recessed for a brief break, Clint stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The wind was cool against his face, and the sounds of the city seemed distant, as if the entire world had been suspended in that moment. He pulled out his phone, checking the messages that had piled up while he was in court. Most were from his team, all confirming that the evidence had been successfully delivered. One message stood out, though. It was from Veronica. "We've done it," she wrote. "The truth's out. There's no way they can spin this. This case is yours." Clint smiled to himself, pocketing his phone. It wasn't over yet. But it sure felt like they were on the right path. Clint walked back into the courtroom, his stride more purposeful than ever. As he re-entered, the murmurs of the crowd seemed louder now, their whispers tinged with both disbelief and anticipation. What had just been revealed was nothing short of explosive. The courtroom had felt like it was on the verge of chaos as Jessica's testimony had rocked the foundation of the prosecution's case. But Clint knew better than to rest on his laurels. He had exposed a massive flaw, but the real challenge was just beginning. David Carter, the opposing attorney, wasn't going to take this lying down. Clint could already tell that Carter's team had been scrambling to devise a counterattack. They would try to discredit the evidence, spin the facts, and manipulate the jury into thinking that this was all just a misunderstanding. But Clint was ready for them. He had anticipated this. The real war, the one that would define the outcome of this trial, was about to begin. As the recess came to an end, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Thompson banged her gavel to bring the room back to order. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, turning to the defense counsel. "Do you have anything to address the new evidence presented by the defense?" Carter stood, his face a mask of calm determination. "Yes, Your Honor," he began, his voice steady. "We would like to request that the court disregard the testimony of Ms. Marks. We believe that her claims are based on hearsay and are unsubstantiated. Furthermore, we have evidence that directly contradicts her findings." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Clint's face remained impassive. He had anticipated this exact move from Carter. It was a typical defense tactic: dismiss the evidence and the witness in an attempt to discredit the case. Clint, however, was ready. "Your Honor," Clint interjected smoothly, standing and addressing the judge. "I find it interesting that Mr. Carter would call into question the credibility of our expert witness. Ms. Marks is an investigative reporter with a reputation for uncovering the truth. She's not the kind of person who would make unfounded claims. In fact, her findings were corroborated by multiple independent sources, each of whom has reviewed the material presented in the article. This is not hearsay, and it certainly isn't unsubstantiated." Carter's gaze flicked toward Clint, a subtle challenge in his eyes. "We will, of course, present our own evidence to counter these accusations," Carter said with an air of superiority. "And I'm certain that the jury will understand the discrepancies in Ms. Marks's testimony." Clint's voice remained calm, but his words cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. "Mr. Carter, let's not confuse the jury with empty words. The truth is, the evidence we've presented is irrefutable. There were no legitimate sources in Mr. Grayson's article, just lies and fabrications. And that is the heart of the matter. The fact that the Times published this piece with such reckless disregard for the truth is what we are here to address." Clint's words settled into the room like a stone dropped into a still pond, causing a ripple of unease that swept over the courtroom. Carter had no immediate response, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the defense team had been caught off guard. But then, Carter's assistant approached him, whispering in his ear. Clint could see the wheels turning in Carter's mind. He was already planning his next move. Clint knew that Carter wasn't about to let this slide. The stakes were too high, and his reputation was on the line. The case was getting personal. Carter turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess to review the new evidence that has been introduced. It is crucial that we ensure the integrity of our position." Judge Thompson nodded. "Granted. We will take a short recess. Please return in 15 minutes." As the courtroom filed out for the break, Clint remained seated at the defense table. His mind was sharp, his focus unwavering. He knew that Carter was going to pull out all the stops to discredit the evidence. It was only a matter of time before they tried to muddy the waters. But Clint wasn't worried. He had planned for this. And if the defense tried to counter with anything less than the truth, Clint would tear it apart. Outside the courtroom, Clint's team was already huddled together, whispering among themselves. Veronica approached him first. "Clint, we need to be prepared," she said, her tone tense. "Carter's not going to back down. He's going to come at us with everything he's got." Clint nodded slowly. "I know. But we have the truth on our side. We can't let them manipulate the facts. They're going to try to spin this as a simple misunderstanding, a series of coincidences. We need to stay focused. If they want to bring in counter-evidence, we'll tear it apart, piece by piece." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "I've got the final piece of evidence ready. It's a smoking gun, Clint. If they try to discredit us, we drop this." Clint's gaze sharpened as he met her eyes. "What is it?" Veronica pulled out a thick folder from her bag, the contents meticulously organized. "It's a series of internal emails from Grayson's editor-in-chief. They discussed the intentional omission of key information that would have completely changed the story. The editor knew about the lack of verifiable sources and greenlit the piece anyway." Clint smiled, a grim but satisfied expression crossing his face. "Perfect. That's the bombshell we need. When they try to call Jessica Marks's credibility into question, we drop this on the table, and there's no coming back from it." As the brief recess ended, the courtroom began to fill again. Clint stood, straightening his tie, ready for what was coming next. Carter was already seated at the defense table, his eyes locked onto Clint with a renewed sense of determination. The battle had just begun. Judge Thompson returned to the bench, and the room fell silent once again. "Mr. Carter, you may proceed with your rebuttal." Carter stood, his face a mask of professionalism. "Thank you, Your Honor. We would like to present new evidence that contradicts the claims made by Ms. Marks." As he began his presentation, Clint kept his focus sharp, watching every move, waiting for the right moment. He knew it was coming, Carter's last-ditch attempt to salvage the case. And when the time came, Clint would strike. The courtroom was thick with tension as Carter stood before the judge, presenting his defense. The jury sat in rapt attention, their eyes scanning every word and gesture, every piece of evidence laid before them. Clint could feel the heat of the battle intensify, the stakes higher than ever. This wasn't just about proving Grayson and the Times were guilty, it was about ensuring that the truth would stand, no matter how hard they fought to hide it. Clint sat with his team, listening closely to Carter's rebuttal. He had expected the defense to make a move, but he hadn't anticipated just how far they'd go to manipulate the evidence. Carter's argument hinged on one key point: the idea that Jessica Marks's testimony was tainted, that it was based on hearsay from unreliable sources. "Your Honor," Carter began, his voice steady and commanding, "as we've already shown, the testimony of Ms. Marks cannot be trusted. The so-called whistleblowers that she claims to have tracked down are in fact individuals with questionable backgrounds, some of whom have criminal records. It's clear that her so-called investigation was driven by bias, and her findings cannot be relied upon." The jury's attention sharpened. Clint could see the faces of the jurors as they exchanged uncertain glances. Carter was good at what he did, and his words carried weight. He wasn't just attacking Marks's credibility, he was attempting to make the jury question the entire foundation of the case. Clint knew this wasn't the time to react. He had a strategy, and he was going to stick to it. It was all about timing. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Mr. Carter," Clint said, rising to his feet with a calm yet authoritative tone, "it's clear that the defense is trying to distract from the truth. But the truth is undeniable. Jessica Marks's findings were corroborated by multiple independent sources. The evidence she presented was not based on hearsay, it was fact, gathered through hard work and careful investigation. Clint turned toward the jury, making eye contact with each of them in turn. But if you want to talk about bias, let's talk about the bias that runs through this entire case. The bias of an industry willing to sacrifice a man's reputation for the sake of a sensational headline. The bias of a media giant that ignored the truth in favor of a story that would sell. Carter's face tightened, but Clint wasn't done yet. Mr. Grayson and his team knew full well that the sources they relied on were fabricated. And it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate decision to put their own interests ahead of the truth. They misled the public, they misled this courtroom, and they have misled every single person who has been affected by their lies. Clint paused for a moment, letting the gravity of his words sink in. The jury was listening now, their faces locked in concentration. He could feel the tide turning, but it wasn't time to let up. Your Honor, Clint said, turning to Judge Thompson, I ask that we now introduce the final piece of evidence to support our claims. This evidence is irrefutable, and it will show the jury exactly how far the defendants were willing to go to protect their own agenda. Judge Thompson nodded. Proceed, Mr. Eastwood. Clint motioned for Veronica, who stepped forward with the folder that had been prepared for just this moment. She handed it to Clint, who presented it to the court with a sense of finality. These, Clint said, as he turned to the jury, are a series of internal emails from Mr. Grayson's editor-in-chief, discussing the intentional omission of key facts that would have completely undermined the story that was published. These emails clearly show that the editor knew about the lack of verifiable sources and made the decision to proceed with the publication of the article anyway. He began reading from the emails aloud, each one more damning than the last. The jury sat in silence, absorbing the details. One email, sent between Grayson and his editor, read, "We know the sources aren't ideal, but this story will be huge. We can always deal with the fallout later." Another email from the editor read, "Let's leave out the part about verifying the sources. We can't afford to miss this opportunity." And the most damning of them all, Grayson, "I know these sources are questionable. But the truth is, we need this article to sell. I'm willing to take the heat if we have to." As Clint finished reading, the courtroom was eerily quiet. Even the defense team seemed momentarily stunned by the weight of what had just been revealed. These were not just emails from an editor, they were admissions of negligence, of willful disregard for the truth, and of the lengths to which the Times had gone to push a story that would sell, no matter the cost. Clint let the silence linger for a moment longer before he spoke again, his voice calm but filled with undeniable conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you have just seen and heard is the final piece of this puzzle. The defense's argument rests on the idea that this was all a misunderstanding, that there was no malice involved. But these emails show the truth, the Times knew exactly what they were doing. They knew they were publishing false information, and they did it anyway, all for the sake of profit and prestige." He turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, we request that the jury be instructed to consider the full weight of this evidence. The defense is no longer in a position to deny the truth." Judge Thompson looked up from her notes, her expression neutral. "I will allow this evidence to stand, Mr. Eastwood. The jury will take this into consideration as they deliberate." Clint took a deep breath, letting the moment wash over him. He had given everything he had in this case, and now all he could do was wait. The ball was in the jury's court. He had presented the truth, laid it bare for them to see. It was up to them to decide how they would respond. As the courtroom recessed for the day, Clint stepped outside, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He needed a moment to breathe, to process everything that had happened. The case wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks, Clint felt a sense of calm. He had done his job. Now, all he could do was wait for the jury to make their decision. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to Veronica, "We've done everything we can. It's in their hands now." She replied almost instantly, "You've done more than enough. You've got this." Clint allowed himself a small smile, but the weight of the situation remained. It wasn't over. Not yet. But as he looked out over the city, he knew one thing for sure: he was going to win this fight. And when the verdict came, it would be a victory not just for him, but for truth itself. The days following Clint's final presentation were a blur. The courtroom, once a battleground, was now quiet, and Clint found himself pacing through his office, unable to focus on anything but the looming verdict. He had given everything he had to this case, his energy, his focus, his passion, and now it was out of his hands. The jury had deliberated for 2 full days, the silence from the courtroom only adding to the weight that hung in the air. Clint had tried to distract himself with other cases, but it felt like every phone call, every email, every conversation was centered around the trial. He could feel the eyes of the city on him, waiting for the outcome. It was early in the morning on the 3rd day when Clint received the call he had been dreading, and longing for. "Mr. Eastwood," the voice on the other end of the line was a calm, professional one, Judge Thompson's clerk. "The jury has reached a verdict. The court will reconvene at 11 a.m. today for the announcement." Clint's heart skipped a beat. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of the moment felt almost unbearable. He thanked the clerk and hung up the phone, his hands shaking slightly as he set it down on the desk. The morning passed in a haze of activity. Clint went over his notes one last time, making sure everything was in order. But despite his attempts to stay focused, his mind kept drifting back to the courtroom, to the jury, to the faces he had studied so intently during the trial. He wondered what they were thinking, what their decision would be. By the time Clint arrived at the courthouse, the crowd outside had already begun to gather. News vans lined the street, reporters with microphones ready to broadcast every detail. As Clint made his way inside, the familiar hum of anticipation filled the air. He exchanged quick nods with his colleagues, but his thoughts were far away. The only thing that mattered now was the moment when the verdict was read. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The jury sat, their expressions unreadable. Clint could feel their gazes on him as he took his seat at the defense table, flanked by Veronica and the rest of his team. Across from him, Carter and his team were just as still, their faces betraying nothing. Judge Thompson entered, her robe sweeping the floor as she made her way to the bench. She glanced over at the jury and then back to the room, her voice steady as she addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, the jury has reached a verdict. Will the foreperson please rise?" The room fell silent as the foreperson, a middle-aged man with gray hair, stood. He looked around the room briefly before turning toward the judge. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Grayson Media, guilty of publishing false and misleading information that led to substantial harm to Mr. Eastwood's reputation," the foreperson declared, his voice clear and unwavering. "We also find that the editorial team, including the editor-in-chief, acted with willful negligence and malice in publishing the article." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, but Clint remained still, his face betraying no emotion. He could feel a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp awareness of what had just been achieved. "Thank you," Judge Thompson said, her voice solemn but firm. "The court will now move on to the sentencing phase. Mr. Eastwood, your victory is well earned. The jury has found the truth in your favor. Grayson Media will be held accountable for their actions." The room erupted into applause, but Clint remained seated, his mind already shifting toward the next steps. The fight wasn't over yet, but it had taken a decisive turn in his favor. As the courtroom began to clear, Clint found himself face to face with Jessica Marks, who had been waiting for this moment as well. She stepped forward, offering him a broad smile. "You did it, Clint," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You proved the truth, and you won." Clint allowed himself a rare moment of relaxation. "We did it," he corrected her, smiling back. "It's all about the truth. That's what matters." Jessica nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "And now the world knows it. But as the reporters crowded around Clint, bombarding him with questions, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The battle had been won, but there was still a long road ahead. Grayson Media wasn't going to go down without a fight. And Clint knew that, despite this victory, the war was far from over. Later that day, as Clint sat in his office, reviewing the details of the case for his final report, his phone rang again. This time, it was Veronica. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "I just got word that Grayson Media is filing an appeal." Clint's jaw tightened. He had known this was coming. Grayson wouldn't take this loss lying down, they would fight it to the bitter end. "They're not going to stop," Clint muttered, rubbing his eyes. "They'll throw everything they have at us." "But they've lost," Veronica said, her tone firm. "We have the truth. And we have the jury's decision. They can appeal all they want, but it doesn't change the facts. The case is solid." Clint leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I know. But it's going to be a long road. They'll drag this out for as long as they can." Veronica was quiet for a moment before she spoke again, this time softer. "Clint, you did it. You proved the truth. That's what matters." Clint smiled wearily. "Yeah, you're right. But there's always more to be done." He looked out of his office window, watching the city bustle below. It was a beautiful day, the sun shining brightly over the skyline. For the first time in a long while, Clint felt a sense of peace. He had fought the good fight, and the truth had prevailed. But as he sat there, lost in thought, he knew that there would always be more battles to fight. The fight for justice was never over. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The weeks following the verdict felt like a strange mix of accomplishment and uncertainty. Clint's name had become synonymous with justice in the city. The media hailed him as the man who took down a corporate giant, and his phone didn't stop ringing. Lawyers, journalists, and even a few politicians reached out, offering congratulations, seeking advice, or simply wanting to be associated with his high-profile win. But behind the scenes, Clint knew the battle was far from over. Grayson Media had filed an appeal, and this wasn't just a legal technicality, it was a fight for the very heart of the case. The higher courts would likely take months to review the case, and in that time, the media moguls at Grayson would stop at nothing to discredit him. Clint had won in the courtroom, but now he had to stay ahead of an ever-growing storm. Late one evening, Clint sat in his office, reviewing a mountain of legal documents. The appeal brief had just arrived from the opposition, thick with legal jargon and complex arguments. Grayson's team was pulling out all the stops, claiming that the jury had been swayed by emotion and not the facts. They were hoping to convince the appellate court to either overturn the decision or grant a new trial. Clint took a deep breath and set the brief aside. He'd read it through twice already, and each time, the arguments had the same hollow ring. They were desperate. Grayson had been caught in their lies, and now they were trying to cover it up with legal maneuvering. He rubbed his eyes and glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. His office was dimly lit, the city lights outside casting long shadows across the room. Veronica had long since gone home, and his team was scattered, each working on their own cases. Clint was alone, but he was used to that. The weight of this case, the significance of the verdict, it all rested on his shoulders. Just then, his phone buzzed. Clint, the voice on the other end was familiar, warm even. It was Jessica Marks. "I just wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" Clint leaned back in his chair, grateful for the distraction. "I'm surviving," he replied with a tired smile. "The appeal came through today. Grayson's team is pulling every trick in the book. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up." "I've been following it," Jessica said, her tone serious. "But you know what they say, truth doesn't bend." Grayson might have money and influence, but they can't change what happened. And they certainly can't change the facts. Clint chuckled softly. You're right about that. But their lawyers are trying to paint me as some kind of media-savvy opportunist. It's a game of perception, and they're playing it well. Jessica was quiet for a moment before speaking again. You've got something they don't have, Clint. The truth. And that's more powerful than anything they can throw at you. This appeal is just a stall tactic. They know they've lost. They're just hoping you'll get worn out. Clint nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'm not going to let them wear me down. But it's going to be a long road ahead. I need to stay ahead of the game. There was a pause before Jessica spoke again, her voice more determined now. Then we'll keep fighting. Together. You don't have to do this alone. Clint's heart swelled at her words. Thanks, Jessica. You've been a huge help in all this. I don't know what I'd have done without you. Well, you'll never have to find out, she said with a smile in her voice. Now, get some rest. You'll need it for the next round. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, and ended the call. It was a small moment of reassurance, but in that moment, Clint knew that he wasn't alone in this fight. The road to appeal would be grueling, but with Jessica by his side, and with the truth firmly on his side, he was ready for whatever came next. Over the next few weeks, Clint's life became a whirlwind of preparation. Grayson Media's appeal team had enlisted some of the best legal minds in the country, and they were pulling no punches. But Clint was undeterred. He assembled a crack team of his own. Veronica, his trusted colleague, had become indispensable. She handled the day-to-day operations of their firm while Clint focused on strategy, poring over case law, preparing rebuttals, and even re-interviewing key witnesses to make sure every detail was perfect. The pressure mounted daily, but Clint stayed focused. He knew that if he faltered now, everything they had fought for would be in jeopardy. And then, as if the universe had heard his resolve, an unexpected ally appeared. A whistleblower from inside Grayson Media reached out, offering additional evidence that further exposed the company's unethical practices. The source, who had once worked closely with Grayson's editorial team, provided Clint's legal team with emails, documents, and even personal testimonies that added fuel to the fire. This changes everything, Veronica said, looking over the new materials. This isn't just about the article anymore. We've got the proof that the corruption runs deeper than we thought. Clint agreed, his mind racing with possibilities. This could be the game changer we needed. If we can get this into the hands of the appellate court, it might make all the difference. The new evidence was solid, but Clint knew better than to count his chickens before they hatched. He had to stay one step ahead, continue to prove that Grayson had knowingly engaged in misconduct. But for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment of optimism. The day of the appeal hearing arrived faster than Clint anticipated. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was thick with tension, the usual hum of anticipation now underlined by a sense of foreboding. As Clint sat in the defendant's chair, he could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him. The Grayson team was sharp as ever, but Clint could sense that something had shifted. There was an energy in the room, a sense that the truth had already begun to tip the scales. Jessica was there, sitting behind him, her presence a steadying force. Her support meant everything to him in these final stages. Mr. Eastwood, Judge Thompson said as she looked up from her papers. We're here today to hear arguments regarding the appeal of the verdict in the case of Grayson Media versus Eastwood. Mr. Carter, you may proceed. Clint could see the determination in Carter's face as he stood and began presenting his arguments. But Clint wasn't worried. He had something the defense didn't, the truth, and now, evidence that they could not deny. The appeal would be a fierce battle, but Clint was more than ready. He had fought for justice in the courtroom once, and now he was prepared to do it again. For Clint Eastwood, this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about making sure the truth was heard, no matter what. The next few days after the appeal hearing passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant preparations. Clint had become so absorbed in the details of the case that it felt like time was slipping through his fingers. He barely remembered the passage of days, all he could focus on was the upcoming decision from the appellate court. The judge had taken the case under advisement, which meant Clint and his team would have to wait for the ruling. There was a strange kind of suspense in the air, as if everything had come to a standstill. Even though Clint had seen victories before, this one felt different. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It had become symbolic, the fight against corruption, against powerful institutions abusing their influence. The weight of the situation was becoming harder to ignore. Clint had made sacrifices, his time, his energy, and his personal life, almost all of which had been consumed by this battle. He had put everything into this case, and now, the verdict on the appeal would determine if it had all been worth it. That evening, Clint sat at his desk, staring out of the window of his office. The city lights shimmered in the distance, a kaleidoscope of activity outside his small bubble of quiet contemplation. For the first time in a long while, Clint felt the crushing weight of doubt creep into his mind. Did I do enough? He asked himself quietly, rubbing his temples. Did I push hard enough? Did I leave any stone unturned? He had spent years building his reputation as a tenacious lawyer, someone who fought for the truth no matter the cost. But now, as he approached the final moments of this case, his confidence wavered. He had to trust the system, trust that the truth would be enough. But there was always the fear that a powerful entity like Grayson Media could twist things, manipulate them, or simply wear down the process with endless appeals. Clint. The voice from the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Jessica, standing in the doorway with a gentle smile. Her presence was always a reminder of the strength he had in his corner. Clint turned to look at her, a tired smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Hey. Just, trying to clear my head. What's up? I was going over the latest briefs for the case, she said, stepping inside and handing him a folder. I think we're ready. We've got everything we need. Now we just wait. But I wanted to remind you of something. Clint took the folder and flipped it open, skimming through the notes. What's that? Jessica perched herself on the edge of the desk, folding her arms. I know you're worried about what could happen. But I also know how hard you've worked on this. The truth is on our side, Clint. And no matter how long this takes, or how hard it gets, you've already done what no one else could. You've brought the truth to light. That's more than anyone could have asked for. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in days, Clint let out a slow breath, feeling the tension leave his shoulders. Thanks, he murmured, gazing down at the documents in front of him. I needed to hear that. Jessica smiled warmly. I'm not going anywhere. We'll get through this, together. The simple reassurance of having her there was enough to push the doubts aside, if only for a moment. Clint knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The waiting. The uncertainty. But now, with the support of those who believed in him, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The days turned into a week. Then 2. And then, on the morning of the 3rd week, the decision came. Clint's phone rang early, so early that the sound made him start awake. He had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning in his bed, restless. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand and saw the name on the screen, Judge Thompson's office. Clint Eastwood, he answered, his voice groggy but steady. Mr. Eastwood, the clerk said, her voice calm. The court has reached a decision regarding the appeal. The ruling will be read in open court at 10 a.m. Please be prepared to attend. Clint's heart raced. The time had come. He thanked the clerk and hung up, sitting up in bed for a moment. The weight of the moment felt like a physical force pressing down on him. He had prepared for this moment for months, yet now that it was finally here, it felt like nothing could fully prepare him for the outcome. By 10 a.m., Clint, Veronica, and Jessica were back in the courtroom, seated in their usual places. The room was packed with reporters, some familiar faces from the media frenzy after the first trial, others just now catching wind of the next chapter in this high-profile case. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if the whole city was holding its breath. The courtroom door opened, and Judge Thompson entered. Her stern expression remained unchanged, but there was an unmistakable gravity in her movements. The noise of the room quieted instantly as she approached the bench. "Mr. Eastwood, Mr. Carter," Judge Thompson began, her voice clear. "This court has reviewed all of the arguments, including the appeal filed by Grayson Media. After careful deliberation, the decision is as follows." Clint's pulse quickened as his hands gripped the edge of the table in front of him. Every person in the room seemed to lean in, waiting for the judge to speak. "The appellate court has upheld the original verdict in favor of Mr. Eastwood. Grayson Media's appeal is denied. The court further affirms the decision regarding damages and legal fees. Mr. Eastwood's claims of defamation and harm to his reputation were substantiated by the jury's findings." The room seemed to explode with reactions. The reporters scrambled to take notes, the air thick with the murmurs of disbelief and excitement. Clint allowed himself a moment to breathe. The weight in his chest that had been there for weeks finally lifted. But it wasn't just relief. It was satisfaction. The truth had prevailed. Grayson Media, despite their best efforts, had lost. And this time, there was no more wriggling out of it. Judge Thompson gavelled the decision, and the room quieted once more. "This court is adjourned." As Clint stood up, his legs felt like they could barely hold him. Veronica gave him a quick pat on the back, her smile wide and victorious. Jessica was there beside him, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she said softly. Clint nodded, his own smile spreading slowly across his face. "We did it." It wasn't just a win in the courtroom. It was a victory for justice. A victory for truth. And Clint had fought for it every step of the way. As they left the courthouse, Clint knew that this victory, while significant, was only one part of the bigger picture. The road had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. The victory in the courtroom was more than just a personal achievement for Clint Eastwood, it was a monumental moment that reverberated throughout the media landscape. News outlets, both local and national, buzzed with the outcome. The case had captured the public's attention, and now, the story of Clint's victory over one of the most powerful media conglomerates in the country was the talk of the town. Clint, however, wasn't the type to relish in the spotlight for long. As much as the victory meant, he knew the road ahead was not going to be a simple one. The media empire he had just brought down wasn't going to disappear quietly. The battle had been won, but the war, Clint could feel it in his bones, was far from over. It was the day after the ruling when Clint found himself back in his office, sitting at his desk, the familiar weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. He stared at the stack of paperwork that awaited him, more cases, more clients, more challenges. For a brief moment, he thought about taking a break, maybe getting away for a few days, but the thought quickly faded. Clint knew that if he stopped now, the adrenaline that had carried him through this fight might slip away, and he wasn't ready to let go. Jessica entered the office, her usual calm demeanor softening the intensity in the air. She walked over to Clint's desk, a cup of coffee in hand. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said, a gentle smile crossing her face as she handed him the coffee. "Take a break, Clint. You've earned it." Clint took the cup, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. He let out a long sigh, sitting back in his chair. "I don't know if I can. There's still so much to do. The aftermath. The media's still going to have their say, and who knows how Grayson will react. This isn't over." Jessica sat across from him, her face thoughtful. "You're right. Grayson's not going to just roll over. They'll try something, whether it's another appeal or a smear campaign. But you've already proved something huge, this wasn't just about winning a case. It's about showing people that the truth has power, no matter how big or influential the opposition is. Clint nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a blanket of responsibility. I know. But there's still a part of me that's waiting for the other shoe to drop. What if they come at me again? What if they try to discredit everything we've done? Jessica leaned forward, her voice steady. Then we fight back. We've got the law on our side, and more importantly, we have the truth. And the people know it. It's not just about you anymore, Clint. It's about what you stand for. And people are paying attention. Clint's gaze shifted to the window, the city stretching out before him in a patchwork of lights and life. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the relief that had been slowly building within him. The sense of justice. Of right prevailing over wrong. I hope you're right, he said quietly. But I've been in this game long enough to know that things don't always play out like you think. Jessica smiled softly. Yeah, but that's why you're Clint Eastwood. You don't back down. And that's what people respect. You fight for what's right. There was a pause as Clint took a sip of the coffee, feeling the familiar warmth spread through him. He couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had fought for something bigger than himself. He'd fought for the truth. And maybe, just maybe, he had finally won a battle that needed to be won. Later that day, Clint received an unexpected call from one of his old colleagues, a journalist named Terry Calloway. Terry had been covering legal cases for years and had seen Clint's rise to prominence. Clint. Terry's voice rang with excitement as soon as Clint answered. I've been reading about your victory. This is huge, my friend. You've got the media world talking. Clint smiled, his guard coming down just a little. Thanks, Terry. I appreciate that. It's been a wild ride. I'm sure it has, Terry replied. Listen, I've got something I want to pitch you. There's a documentary crew that's been following your case since the beginning. They're offering to do a feature on the trial, your role in it, and the aftermath. It could be huge. You'd have a chance to set the record straight, and it could shed light on the larger issue of media manipulation. What do you think? Clint leaned back in his chair, considering the proposition. He had never been one to relish the spotlight, and the idea of putting his personal life under a microscope didn't exactly thrill him. But he knew the power of media. And if the story was told right, it could do more than just satisfy his ego, it could make a lasting impact. I'm not sure, Clint said slowly. I didn't get into this to be the face of some media circus. I just wanted to fight for what was right. I get it, Terry said, his tone understanding. But this could be your chance to tell your side of the story. You've already done the hard part. The legal battles. Now, it's about making sure people understand the bigger picture. You have a platform now, Clint. And with your story, you could influence a lot of people. Clint paused, running his fingers through his hair. He had always shied away from the public eye. But what if this was more than just self-promotion? What if it could help expose the dark side of media manipulation in a way that was more powerful than any courtroom argument? I'll think about it, Clint finally said, making up his mind. But I'll need to be sure this is handled carefully. No sensationalism. Just the facts. Of course, Terry said. I wouldn't expect anything less. After the call ended, Clint sat for a while in deep thought. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing, this case had already changed everything. The fight for truth was far from over, and if the media wanted to keep playing this game, Clint would meet them head-on. The phone call from Terry had opened a door, and Clint was ready to step through it. The world was watching, and now, more than ever, Clint had the chance to not just fight for the truth but to ensure that it was heard by the millions who had been lied to, manipulated, and controlled for far too long. Days passed, and the media storm around Clint continued to rage. But instead of running from it, Clint embraced it. He allowed the documentary crew to film interviews, discussions, and even some behind-the-scenes moments. It was an opportunity to tell his story, to show people the human side of the battle that had been fought in the name of justice. It wasn't easy. Every interview was a reminder of the personal toll the case had taken. But Clint knew it was the right decision. The story of his legal victory had become more than just a win for him. It had become a win for everyone who had ever felt powerless against a corrupt system. And now, the world would see it. As Clint Eastwood stepped into the light, he realized that his journey was far from over. The battle for truth and justice was ongoing, and he was ready for whatever came next. As the weeks passed, Clint settled into a strange rhythm of life. The buzz of the courtroom victory began to fade, but the echoes of the case reverberated through every corner of his existence. The documentary, which had started as a side project, quickly became more than he had anticipated. Interviews, behind-the-scenes footage, and discussions about media ethics filled his days, and Clint found himself adjusting to the uninvited attention that came with the territory. It wasn't just the media that had their eyes on him now. Grayson Media had begun their own counterattack. Although their initial reaction to the ruling had been subdued, Clint could sense the storm brewing. Behind closed doors, Grayson was likely strategizing their next move, whether it was a financial settlement or a public campaign designed to discredit him. Despite the growing tension, Clint remained focused. His team, especially Jessica, kept pushing forward with other cases, but Clint's mind couldn't help but return to the central conflict, the fight against corporate corruption, the same battle that had led him here in the first place. One chilly autumn morning, Clint sat in his office, reviewing case files when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Jessica, "Call me when you have a minute. It's about Grayson." His stomach tightened as he dialed her number. He knew this wasn't going to be a casual check-in. "Clint," Jessica's voice came through the line, laced with urgency. "We've just gotten word that Grayson's planning something big. They've filed a motion to reopen the case. They're claiming the original ruling was flawed, and they've got a new legal team on it." Clint's hand gripped the edge of his desk. "What's their angle?" "They're accusing you of withholding evidence. They're trying to argue that we misled the jury about the extent of their media manipulation. They've got a new expert witness, someone with a lot of credibility in the field. We're going to need to prepare for a major fight." Clint leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The pressure, which had been mounting slowly since the verdict, now felt unbearable. "Do we have any idea what their next move will be?" "They're pushing for an emergency hearing. They want to get the decision overturned quickly. It could take months, Clint. Or it could happen next week. We don't know yet, but we need to be ready. This isn't just a legal challenge, it's a public one, too. They're going to paint you as the villain, try to undermine everything we've worked for." Clint closed his eyes, processing the weight of her words. The room seemed smaller all of a sudden, the walls closing in. This wasn't just another legal case. It was a war of attrition, a battle for his reputation, for the legacy of his career. "All right," Clint said after a long pause, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Let's prepare. I won't let them turn this into a circus." For the next several days, Clint and his team worked tirelessly, gathering new evidence, reaching out to experts, and reviewing every aspect of the case. The looming threat of Grayson Media's counterattack had reinvigorated him, even as it drained him. This was not just a fight for justice anymore, this was a fight for survival. Every legal argument, every piece of evidence was carefully analyzed for weaknesses. But Clint knew the emotional toll this case was taking on him. He hadn't truly allowed himself to process the impact of the long months of stress, of being in the spotlight, of dealing with the media circus. His personal life had taken a back seat to the case, and now, he found himself facing the consequences of that neglect. One evening, as Clint sat in his office, staring at the mounting paperwork, the door creaked open. Veronica stepped inside, her face a mixture of concern and resolve. Clint, she said softly, you've been pushing yourself too hard. You need to take a step back. This case, this fight, it's consuming you. What about everything else? What about you? Clint ran a hand over his face, feeling the exhaustion deep in his bones. I don't have time for anything else, Veronica. Not right now. Grayson isn't going to stop. If I don't keep fighting, then everything we've worked for, everything I've sacrificed, goes down the drain. Veronica's eyes softened, but there was a firmness in her tone. I know you care about this case, Clint. But you can't lose yourself in it. You've already won. The world knows the truth. Don't let Grayson drag you into another endless battle. You've already proven what you needed to. Don't let them break you. Clint stared at her for a long time, his mind swirling. She was right, of course. This fight was never just about the case, it was about something much bigger. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that it wasn't just about winning, it was about the life he had beyond the courtroom, the people who mattered to him. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Maybe I've been letting this take over everything. Veronica took a seat beside him, offering him the support he needed in that moment. You've already made a difference, Clint. You've shown the world that one person can stand up to the system. And now, you've got the chance to take a step back and enjoy the life you've earned. Just don't let them pull you in again, okay? Clint looked out the window, his thoughts swirling. He had spent his entire career fighting for the truth, but he couldn't lose sight of the things that truly mattered. As he stared at the city below, something clicked. He had to let go of the fight, at least for now. The media and Grayson Media could do whatever they wanted. They would always find new ways to attack, new battles to wage, but he had already won the war. The next day, Clint made a decision that surprised everyone around him, including Jessica and Veronica. He agreed to meet with Terry Calloway and the documentary crew, but with one condition: they would make sure that the story was told the way he wanted it to be told, not as a sensationalized media spectacle, but as a deeper reflection of the issues at play. He also made the choice to step away from the case for a little while. He didn't know how long it would take for things to settle, but he knew that for the first time in years, he needed to rest, to reconnect with himself, and to let go of the endless grind of legal battles. The decision was hard. Clint knew that the media would continue to focus on him, on his victory, on the case. But he had done enough. He had won his battle, and now it was time to move forward. As Clint sat back in his chair and closed his eyes, he realized that this was more than just the end of one chapter. It was the beginning of a new one. The fight for truth was far from over, but Clint knew that he had already changed the world, one case at a time. For the first time in a long time, Clint felt the faintest glimmer of peace. But as the saying goes, peace is often fleeting. And Clint knew, deep down, that the storm was never truly over. It was only the calm before the next wave. As the days stretched on, Clint took small steps toward reclaiming his personal life. Time with friends, reconnecting with family, and finally finding moments to breathe. But the weight of the fight lingered. The media storm had not completely died down, and there was still the looming specter of Grayson Media and their relentless pursuit of victory. Clint had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The true test of his resilience was still to come. The calm that Clint had longed for felt more like an illusion than a reality. He had decided to step back, to regain a sense of balance in his life, but the quiet was deceptive. The media attention hadn't waned, if anything, it had intensified. Grayson Media, seemingly taking every opportunity to rebound, had begun a relentless public relations campaign. Headlines and talk show segments dissected every part of Clint's career, both the past victories and the current battle. The story wasn't just about Clint anymore, it was about a larger narrative, the fall of corporate giants and the power of one man's defiance. Clint knew the media would continue to pounce on him. He couldn't change that, but what unsettled him more was the realization that something else was brewing in the shadows, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was another long evening in Clint's office, the soft hum of the city outside offering little comfort. He had hoped the quiet would bring clarity, but instead, it filled him with restlessness. Jessica had been relentless in her pursuit of more cases, and despite the success they had shared, Clint felt an unfamiliar distance creeping into their professional relationship. She was ambitious, driven, and smart, but lately, she seemed distracted, her focus less on the bigger picture and more on the smaller, more immediate battles that came with the job. Clint knew that she was under pressure, too. But what concerned him was that, like him, Jessica was always running at full throttle. There was no moment for pause, no opportunity to reflect. The phone rang, pulling Clint from his thoughts. It was a call from his old colleague, Terry Calloway. "Clint," Terry's voice was tense. "I don't know how to say this, but Grayson's come after you again. I've been hearing rumors, they're launching a full-blown smear campaign. They're targeting your credibility, your entire career. They've even gone as far as accusing you of unethical practices during your past cases." Clint froze. The news hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known it was coming, but hearing it confirmed brought a cold reality crashing down on him. "What are they saying exactly?" Clint asked, his voice low and controlled. "They've got people coming out of the woodwork. Some ex-clients, a few disgruntled associates who claim you manipulated evidence, that you've bent the rules to win cases in the past. The story's been circulating in legal circles, and now, it's going public. They're trying to tear you down, Clint." Clint ran a hand over his face, his mind racing. He had spent his entire career building a reputation of integrity, of fighting for justice. Now, it seemed, all of that was being called into question. He wasn't naive enough to believe this wouldn't happen eventually, but it still stung. "We need to shut this down fast," Clint said, his voice taking on a steely edge. "Get me everything they've got. Every claim. Every person they've approached. I need to know what we're up against." "On it," Terry replied. "I'll get the information to you as soon as possible. But Clint, you need to be prepared. This isn't going to be easy." Clint stared at the phone as he ended the call. His mind churned with the implications. It wasn't just about defending his reputation now, it was about protecting everything he had built. The stakes were higher than ever. The next day, Clint convened a meeting with Jessica. She arrived at his office with a stack of legal briefs and case files in hand, her eyes focused and determined, but Clint could see the exhaustion beneath the surface. "Jessica, we need to talk," he said, motioning for her to sit down. "What's going on?" she asked, dropping the files onto his desk. "Grayson's stepping up their game. They're going after my credibility, accusing me of unethical practices. They're trying to destroy everything we've worked for." Jessica's expression hardened. "I knew this was coming. It was only a matter of time before they started playing dirty." Clint nodded. "Exactly. But this is different. We can't just fight back in the courtroom anymore. They've gone public with this. We need to hit them harder than they've ever been hit." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "How?" "I need to go on the offensive," Clint said, his voice firm. "We can't let them control the narrative. I'll need to do a public statement, address these accusations head-on. It's going to be risky, but if we don't take control, they will." Jessica hesitated, a shadow of doubt crossing her face. "Clint, you know what this could mean, right? The public's already watching. A move like this could either solidify your position or ruin you." "I don't care what it costs," Clint replied, his voice unwavering. "They can't keep doing this. They can't keep pushing me into a corner. If this is going to be a fight, then I'm fighting back." As Clint prepared his public statement, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew the risks were enormous. There was no going back after this. Once he put his name on the line, once he spoke those words to the press, there would be no turning back. But Clint had never been one to shy away from a fight. He had spent his entire career challenging the status quo, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. This was no different. The rules had changed, but Clint's mission remained the same. The day of the press conference arrived, and Clint stood before a sea of cameras and microphones, his heart steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The room was filled with reporters eager for their next headline, the air thick with anticipation. Clint cleared his throat, stepping up to the podium. The weight of the moment settled over him, but he stood tall. He had faced down worse adversaries than Grayson Media. This was just another battle. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clint began, his voice clear and confident, "I stand before you today to address the latest attacks on my reputation and the work that I've done in this field. Over the past few weeks, certain individuals have come forward, making baseless allegations about my practices and integrity. Let me be clear, these claims are false." A murmur rippled through the room as reporters scribbled down notes. Clint continued, unwavering. "Throughout my career, I've fought for justice. I've fought for the truth. I've worked tirelessly to ensure that the law serves all people, regardless of power or influence. And I will not allow these attacks to distract me from that mission. The truth is on our side. I have nothing to hide." The cameras flashed as Clint's words filled the room. He could feel the tension in the air, but he stood firm. This was his moment to reclaim control of the narrative, to make sure that the public knew the truth. "I will continue to fight for what is right," he concluded, his voice resolute. "And I will not let anyone undermine the work that we've done. Thank you." With that, Clint turned and walked away from the podium, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The media would be watching, the public would be listening, and Grayson Media had just made their move. But Clint knew something they didn't: he was ready. Ready to take the fight back to them. Ready to face whatever came next. As Clint left the building, the flash of cameras still blinding him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was far from over. Grayson Media had just thrown the first punch in a new round of this relentless fight. And Clint? He was just getting started. The media blitz following Clint's public statement was immediate and intense. Cameras and reporters were everywhere, constantly trying to capture his every move, analyze every word, and twist it into something salacious. For days, the airwaves were filled with debates about his motives, his credibility, and the consequences of his defiance against Grayson Media. But despite the storm of attention, Clint stood resolute. It was Jessica who noticed first. Clint had spent the last few days buried in legal documents, refusing to let the chaos consume him. But as they sat together one evening, sorting through more files and evidence, Jessica spoke up, her voice softer than usual. "Clint, you've made your statement, but you're not in this alone anymore. People are starting to see your side. The tide's turning, I can feel it." Clint didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. He could feel the weight of her words, but it wasn't the time to celebrate yet. Grayson Media hadn't backed down, they were still mobilizing their forces, still pushing their agenda, and Clint knew the battle wasn't over. "I know, Jessica. But this fight isn't just about me anymore. This is about the system. This is about what's at stake for everyone who has ever been crushed under the weight of corporate power," Clint said, his voice steady. "If we stop now, we lose everything." Jessica nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of concern and admiration. "You're right. But don't forget, this isn't just your fight. We're all in this together." Clint allowed himself a brief moment of gratitude for Jessica's unwavering loyalty. She had been with him through thick and thin, and in many ways, her support had been his anchor throughout the chaos. But he also knew that the fight ahead would require more than just the strength of his team, it would require the courage of those who believed in his cause. The following week, the tide did indeed seem to shift. A new set of leaks emerged from Grayson Media's ranks, and this time, the news wasn't in their favor. A former senior executive from the company had come forward, anonymously at first, but soon their identity was revealed, an insider with direct knowledge of the company's dealings and unethical practices. They had quietly reached out to Clint's team, offering critical information that would support the allegations of Grayson's corruption. Jessica had the story within hours, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Clint, you need to see this." Clint immediately dropped what he was doing, and within minutes, he was on the phone with her, listening to her explain the breakthrough. This could change everything," Clint muttered, his mind racing with the possibilities. "Are they credible? They've been verified. This person knows things about Grayson's internal practices that no one else would know," Jessica replied, a note of excitement creeping into her voice. "This could be the piece we've been waiting for." Clint was silent for a moment, weighing the implications. The insider's testimony was explosive, clear evidence that Grayson Media had been involved in more than just legal shenanigans. Their practices reached into deep, dark corners of the industry. This was more than just a battle for his reputation. This was an opportunity to expose the corruption at the heart of the media empire. The kind of exposure that could change everything. "This is it, Jessica," Clint said, his voice firm. "We need to move fast. We bring this to the public. We expose them for who they really are." The team worked tirelessly to verify the evidence, cross-checking the details with other sources, and building the case for the world to see. As Clint stood in front of the press once again, ready to drop the bombshell, he could feel the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about Grayson anymore, it was about showing the world that the truth could triumph, no matter how powerful the forces trying to silence it were. The press conference was set for the following day, and the media had gathered once more, eager for the next twist in the saga. Clint walked into the room, his heart pounding. This time, however, he wasn't just facing questions about his credibility. He was about to drop a bombshell that could rock the media world to its core. With his usual calm, Clint stepped up to the podium, the reporters leaning forward, hungry for answers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clint began, his voice strong, "I stand before you today with not only a defense of my actions, but with irrefutable evidence of Grayson Media's widespread illegal activities. The truth has always been my weapon, and now, it will be yours." The room fell into a stunned silence as Clint's team released documents and video footage that detailed Grayson Media's internal corruption, their illegal dealings, and manipulation of the media landscape. The evidence was damning, and Clint watched as the reporters absorbed the truth. The first report was a bombshell: Grayson's top executives had been orchestrating media manipulations on a massive scale. They had been involved in financial fraud, suppressing stories that could harm their interests, and even blackmailing individuals to maintain their hold on power. The room buzzed as the details were slowly revealed, each new revelation more shocking than the last. For the first time, Clint felt a sense of vindication. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. Grayson Media, which had long been seen as an untouchable behemoth, was now facing its own reckoning. The following days were a whirlwind. Headlines around the world were dominated by Clint's exposé. The pressure on Grayson Media was immense, and they scrambled to respond, but their efforts were now largely seen as reactive and desperate. The public was turning against them, and their reputation, which had once been bulletproof, began to crumble. Clint and his team continued to gather more evidence, pushing forward with the legal case while keeping the media pressure on Grayson. It was a strategy that had them on the offensive, but Clint knew the battle was far from over. The legal ramifications were only just beginning, and he had no intention of letting up until Grayson was held fully accountable. Late one evening, as Clint sat alone in his office, he received an unexpected call. It was Veronica. "Clint, I just wanted to check in with you," she said, her voice quiet. "I know how much this has been weighing on you. I just wanted to remind you, you've already made a difference. You've already proven that one person can stand against the tide." Clint smiled, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'm not finished yet, Veronica. I can't stop until they've paid for what they've done." "I know," she replied. But don't forget to take care of yourself. This fight is important, but so are you. Clint sat back in his chair, the exhaustion beginning to settle in. I won't forget. I'm just not sure when it'll all end. Just remember, Veronica said, you're not alone in this. For the first time in a long while, Clint felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight wasn't over, but perhaps it didn't have to consume him entirely. The world might still be watching, the battle still ongoing, but Clint knew that he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something bigger. And that, in itself, was enough. But Clint knew that every victory brought with it new challenges. The battle had only just begun. The media storm had reached a fever pitch. Clint's exposé on Grayson Media had reverberated through every corner of the legal and corporate world, and the repercussions were swift. Investors pulled back, board members fled, and the public started questioning the very foundation on which the empire had been built. For the first time in years, Clint felt that a shift was happening, one he had been fighting for, but never truly believed he would see. Yet, despite the victory, Clint couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time he thought about the case, the same questions kept haunting him: what's next? How much further do I need to go to make sure this is all settled? In the days following his public announcement, Clint had been flooded with phone calls from former clients, lawyers, and journalists, all eager to talk about the growing scandal. But it was one call, one single conversation, that would change the trajectory of everything. It came from a familiar voice, Terry Calloway. I don't like the sound of this, Clint, Terry said, his voice sharp and urgent. I've been hearing whispers, and I don't know how much of it's true, but there's something bigger at play here. This isn't just about Grayson anymore. Clint paused, the weight of Terry's words pressing against his chest. What do you mean, Terry? What's bigger than this? I've been in touch with some sources. They're telling me there's another player behind all this. Someone even bigger than Grayson. Someone pulling strings from behind the scenes, Terry continued. You need to be careful. This goes much deeper than you think. Clint's mind raced. Another player? Who could possibly be behind Grayson's media empire? For years, Grayson had operated as the dominant force in the media world, a company so entrenched in power that no one had dared challenge it. Who's behind this? Clint demanded, his voice low and filled with urgency. I'm not sure yet, Terry replied. But I've been hearing rumors of a shadow consortium, unseen, unspoken, but heavily influential. They could be the ones pulling the strings. If you're going to take Grayson down, you need to figure out who they are. Fast. Clint sat back in his chair, absorbing the gravity of the revelation. He had always known that the media world was a web of intertwined interests, but the idea of a hidden cabal controlling everything from behind the curtain added a layer of complexity he hadn't anticipated. Grayson might have been the visible face of corporate corruption, but if someone even more powerful was calling the shots, the game had changed entirely. The next few days were a blur of legal strategy, covert meetings, and hours spent in research. Clint had Jessica working on identifying connections between Grayson and potential third-party interests that could be linked to a larger, unseen network. They combed through financial records, legal filings, and anonymous tips, anything that could provide a lead. But the deeper they dug, the more unsettling the puzzle became. The connections they uncovered were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet every time they connected one dot, it led them to another, and then another. The web was intricate, complex, and vast. One night, after yet another sleepless stretch in the office, Clint sat alone, staring at the files spread out before him. The stack was growing, the evidence mounting, but still, the truth seemed just beyond his reach. It was then that he noticed something, a small, seemingly insignificant detail in one of the documents. It was a name that didn't appear anywhere else, but which seemed to tie everything together. Jackson Hale, Clint muttered to himself, the name rolling off his tongue like a cold warning. Jackson Hale was a name Clint had heard of before, though never in relation to this case. Hale was a silent partner in various industries, a businessman whose wealth and influence were as opaque as the shadows he worked in. He was rumored to have interests in media, energy, technology, and even politics, always operating behind the scenes, never in the public eye. Could Hale be the shadow player behind Grayson? Clint's instincts told him he was on the right track. Hale's network of influence could easily support the kind of manipulative, unethical practices Grayson had been involved in. Clint quickly dialed Jessica's number. "Jessica, I think I've found something," he said, his voice taut with excitement. "We need to dig into Jackson Hale. He's the key. He's the one pulling the strings." Jessica's voice was steady, but Clint could hear the disbelief creeping in. "Hale. You're sure?" "I'm sure," Clint responded. "Get every piece of information you can. I don't care how obscure the source is. We need to find out how deep this goes. If Hale is involved, this is bigger than just a corporate scandal. We're talking about systemic corruption on a global scale." As Jessica and Clint worked through the night, piecing together the trail of evidence, the enormity of their discovery began to settle over them. Jackson Hale wasn't just some anonymous billionaire pulling strings from afar, he was deeply connected to some of the world's most powerful institutions. Political figures, financial elites, global corporations, Hale had fingerprints on it all. The more they uncovered, the more they realized just how much was at stake. The system wasn't just broken, it was built on an infrastructure of secrecy and manipulation, where money and power reigned supreme and the truth had no place. Clint sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had uncovered. He knew that if they exposed Hale, the repercussions would be catastrophic, not just for Grayson, but for the very institutions that held society together. The battle ahead would not just be a legal fight. It would be a war for the future of how information was controlled, how power was wielded, and how the truth was allowed to be seen. Jessica's voice broke through Clint's reverie. "Clint, you need to see this." She was on the phone, her voice urgent and tinged with disbelief. Clint could hear the sound of paper shuffling in the background. "What is it, Jessica?" he asked. "We've got it. The smoking gun." Hale's connections to Grayson aren't just financial, there's a direct link. He's been funding Grayson's legal defense, manipulating public narratives, even influencing regulatory bodies. This is worse than we thought. Clint felt a chill run down his spine. Jackson Hale wasn't just a distant figure in the shadows. He was the mastermind orchestrating everything, the puppet master behind the entire operation. And Clint now had the evidence to prove it. Clint knew one thing for sure, the stakes had just been raised. The war had entered a new phase, and this time, the consequences would be felt far beyond the courtroom. The battle for the truth had only just begun. Clint stood at the center of the storm, the weight of the new information heavy in his chest. The name Jackson Hale had become more than just a lead, it had turned into the crux of a much larger conspiracy, one that stretched far beyond Grayson Media's walls. Hale wasn't just involved in media manipulation, he had his hands in everything. From politics to global finance, it seemed like every major institution had been compromised. The more Clint discovered, the more he realized that going after Grayson alone would be insufficient, this was a fight for the entire system. Jessica worked tirelessly alongside Clint, cross-referencing documents, emails, financial records, and court filings. With each passing day, they uncovered more links between Hale and some of the world's most powerful players. Every connection they found painted a darker picture of a world where the media, government, and business were no longer separate entities but were deeply intertwined, with Hale at the center of it all. The deeper Clint dug, the more he started to question everything. Had he been blind all along? Had his focus on Grayson Media prevented him from seeing the bigger picture? The truth was even more shocking than he had imagined. One evening, after a long stretch of work in the office, Clint sat down with Jessica to reassess their findings. They spread out a series of documents, charts, and a map of connections on the table between them. "Look at this," Clint said, pointing to a series of wire transfers on one of the spreadsheets. "Hale's funding Grayson's legal defense, but it's not just Grayson. There are payments to several other media outlets, think tanks, and even a few politicians. It's a web of influence, all directed by him." Jessica leaned forward, her brow furrowed as she scanned the documents. "It's all connected. Grayson Media isn't the only puppet in this play. Hale has a stake in all of it. How he controls the narrative is incredible." Clint clenched his jaw. "If we expose this, it's not just Grayson's empire that will fall. Hale's influence runs so deep, this could affect governments, economies, the entire fabric of how power works in this country." They both fell silent, taking in the enormity of their discovery. It wasn't just a scandal anymore, it was a global conspiracy. A world that had been manipulated for decades, shaped by a shadowy figure who had never been held accountable. Grayson, it seemed, was just a small part of the puzzle. "We need to go public with this," Clint said, his voice determined. "But we need to do it carefully. This isn't just about exposing Grayson anymore. If we reveal Hale's connections, it's going to shake the very foundation of everything we know. We need to prepare for the fallout." The next few days were a blur of intense preparation. Clint and Jessica knew that they had to be cautious. Exposing Hale and his vast network of influence meant more than just revealing a few names, it was going to send shockwaves through the entire system. But Clint wasn't afraid. Not anymore. With the evidence at hand, Clint's legal team began to draft a comprehensive report, detailing Hale's involvement with Grayson Media and the many other institutions he controlled. But Clint knew that it couldn't just be a legal document, it needed to be something that would capture the public's attention. This wasn't just about winning in a courtroom, it was about winning the court of public opinion. Jessica had a plan. "We need to present this in a way that the world can understand," she said, her eyes alight with determination. "We can't just dump a bunch of legal jargon on them. We need to show the connections, make them personal. The public needs to see that this is about more than just media manipulation. It's about control. It's about the people at the top who are pulling all the strings." Clint agreed. They needed a strategy that would make this feel real to the average person. They couldn't just talk about boardrooms and bank accounts, they needed to connect it to the everyday lives of the people who would be watching. The day of the press conference arrived, and Clint was more prepared than ever. Standing at the podium, he looked out at the sea of reporters and cameras. The room was packed with anticipation, everyone waiting to hear what Clint would reveal next. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clint began, his voice calm yet firm, "what I am about to say will change the way you view the world. Grayson Media may have been the face of the corruption, but it's only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. There is a shadow network of power, one that controls everything we see, hear, and read. And at the center of it all is one man, Jackson Hale." A murmur ran through the room as Clint's words sank in. Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled furiously. Clint continued, laying out the evidence piece by piece: Hale's involvement in Grayson Media, his financial influence, his connections to politicians, CEOs, and global leaders. He spoke of the manipulation of public opinion, of how entire narratives had been shaped to protect the interests of the wealthy and powerful, all under Hale's watchful eye. The reactions were mixed, some reporters were skeptical, others shocked. But the truth was out. The world now knew that the manipulation wasn't just confined to the media industry, it was a systemic issue, one that reached into every corner of society. As the press conference ended, Clint felt a moment of relief, but it was short-lived. The backlash from Hale's supporters was swift. Grayson Media issued a public statement denying everything, calling Clint's claims baseless and accusing him of attempting to destroy the reputation of one of the most respected media companies in the world. But Clint knew better. He had the evidence, and more importantly, he had the public's attention. The truth couldn't be buried anymore. The phone calls began to flood in. Allies, enemies, former colleagues, everyone had an opinion. But one call stood out to Clint, one he hadn't expected. "Clint," the voice on the other end said, "it's Veronica. I just saw the press conference. You did it. You're going to change everything." Clint's heart lifted at the sound of her voice, her words carrying a weight of reassurance he hadn't realized he needed. "Thanks, Veronica. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." "You're right," she said. "But you've done something no one else was brave enough to do. You've started a revolution." Clint's mind raced as he ended the call. The battle was far from won. Hale would fight back, and the media empire he controlled would not crumble easily. But Clint wasn't backing down. The fight had only just begun, and he was ready for whatever came next. In the days following the press conference, Clint and Jessica continued to gather more evidence and refine their strategy. The legal case was moving forward, but the public pressure was mounting. Jackson Hale had yet to respond directly, but Clint knew that when he did, it would be a battle unlike anything he'd faced before. This wasn't just about the media anymore, it was about the very nature of power, control, and truth. As the stakes grew higher, Clint's resolve hardened. He was no longer just a lawyer seeking justice. He was a man on a mission to bring down the most powerful figures in the world, and to show everyone that truth, no matter how buried, would always find a way to rise. The game had changed. The public revelation of Jackson Hale's involvement had ignited a firestorm. The world was watching, and Clint Eastwood, the once obscure lawyer who had started a crusade against a corrupt media empire, was now at the center of a global storm. The media was divided, some were skeptical, calling Clint's claims a desperate attempt to destroy a titan of industry, while others rallied behind him, calling him a hero for exposing the truth. But Clint knew that the real battle wasn't in the court of public opinion, it was in the courtroom itself. He had the evidence, but the legal fight ahead of him would be grueling. Hale's resources were nearly limitless, and he had already begun to mount a counterattack, hiring top lawyers, buying favorable press, and using every tool at his disposal to discredit Clint. Clint couldn't afford to back down. He had come too far, and the stakes were too high. He wasn't just fighting for justice for his clients anymore, he was fighting for a future where the truth wasn't bought and sold by the highest bidder. It was a cold morning when Clint walked into the courthouse for the first hearing regarding the evidence he had presented. The media was swarming outside, and the tension in the air was palpable. Clint couldn't help but notice how many people were watching his every move, the eyes of the world were on him. Jessica was by his side, her calm demeanor a contrast to the frenzy that seemed to swirl around them. "You've got this, Clint," she said, her voice steady as always. "We've come this far. We just need to keep pushing forward." Clint nodded, though his mind was already on the battle ahead. He had no illusions about the difficulty of the fight. Hale would throw everything he had at them, and the legal system was a labyrinth where even the smallest misstep could be exploited. But Clint was determined to see this through. As they entered the courtroom, the tension was thick. On one side, there was the defense team, top-tier lawyers, each one well-dressed and intimidating. On the other side, Clint and his team, smaller in number but armed with truth. The judge, a stern man named Judge Matthews, looked over at Clint with a raised eyebrow as he entered. Clint had faced many judges in his career, but something about Judge Matthews made him uneasy. The man had an air of authority that commanded respect, but also a hint of cynicism that made Clint wonder which side the judge would take in this monumental case. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Matthews began as Clint took his seat, his voice booming across the courtroom. "I trust that you are aware of the gravity of the accusations you've made. This is not a matter to be taken lightly." "I understand, Your Honor," Clint replied, keeping his voice steady. "But I stand by the evidence I've presented. We're not here to make accusations without cause, we're here to expose the truth." Hale's defense team immediately launched into their counterarguments, claiming that Clint's evidence was circumstantial, incomplete, and based on unreliable sources. They painted Clint as a disgruntled lawyer with a personal vendetta rather than a champion for justice. For hours, the courtroom was a battleground. Every piece of evidence Clint presented was met with skepticism, every claim of wrongdoing undermined by Hale's defense team, who seemed to have an answer for everything. Clint was frustrated, but he refused to give up. He knew that Hale had built his empire on lies, and the truth, no matter how long it took, was going to come out. Back in the quiet of his office, Clint reflected on the day's proceedings. He was exhausted, both mentally and physically. The courtroom had been a game of high-stakes chess, and for every move Clint made, it seemed Hale's team had an answer. But Clint wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially not one as important as this. "Jessica," Clint said, looking up from the stack of files on his desk. "We need something more. We need a breakthrough. Something that Hale won't be able to spin away." Jessica looked at him thoughtfully before responding, "There's one thing we haven't tried yet. Hale's personal files. We've been so focused on the public side of things, the media, the companies, but what about his private dealings? If we can find something in his personal records, maybe we can nail him." Clint's eyes lit up with a sudden realization. "You're right. We haven't dug deep enough into his personal life. We need to find something that directly links him to the corruption, something irrefutable." The next several days were a blur of research and investigation. Clint and Jessica worked relentlessly, combing through Hale's personal financial records, private emails, and encrypted messages. It was a race against time. Hale's defense team was already preparing for the next round of legal motions, and Clint knew they had to find something solid to shift the tide in their favor. Then, late one night, Jessica called Clint into her office. Her voice was shaky, but there was a spark of excitement in it. "Clint, I think we've got it." Clint's heart skipped a beat as he walked into her office. On her computer screen was a document, a series of emails between Jackson Hale and several high-ranking politicians, business leaders, and even journalists. The content was shocking. Hale had been orchestrating political campaigns, influencing policy decisions, and even manipulating elections, all with the goal of securing his business interests and expanding his influence. "Look at this," Jessica said, pointing to a specific email. "He's been bribing government officials to pass laws in his favor, all while pushing false narratives in the media to cover it up." Clint read through the emails, his pulse racing. This was it. This was the smoking gun they had been searching for. "We have him," Clint said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the evidence we need. This is going to blow the case wide open." The next morning, Clint stormed into the courtroom, ready to turn the tide once and for all. He had a new piece of evidence, one that was airtight and irrefutable. With this, he knew they had no choice but to listen. When it was Clint's turn to present, he stood tall, holding the documents in his hands. He addressed the court, his voice steady and firm. "Your Honor, I come before you today not just as a lawyer, but as a citizen who believes in the truth. For months, we've been fighting an uphill battle, but today, we have the key to ending this case. We've uncovered a direct link between Jackson Hale and a network of corruption that spans beyond media companies. It extends to government officials, political campaigns, and the very fabric of our democracy." He handed the documents to the judge, watching as Judge Matthews skimmed through them. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the evidence hanging in the air. Finally, after a long pause, Judge Matthews spoke. "Mr. Eastwood, this is unprecedented. If these documents are authentic, they will change the course of this trial, and perhaps the very future of this nation." Clint's heart raced. This was it, the moment of truth. There was no turning back now. Hale's defense team immediately objected, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The evidence was too damning, and the public's trust had already been won. The battle was no longer just about legal maneuvering, it was about exposing a corrupt system that had plagued society for too long. Clint knew the final showdown was coming. The truth had been revealed, and now, he would see it through to the end. The final gambit had been played, and all he had to do was wait for the inevitable collapse of Hale's empire. The courtroom was electric with tension. Clint had laid everything on the table, every email, every financial transaction, every carefully guarded secret of Jackson Hale's network. The ball was in Hale's court, and the public was waiting, holding its collective breath. What could Hale do now? How could he possibly recover from such a devastating blow? Clint could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. This was about justice for everyone who had been silenced, manipulated, or deceived by Hale's empire. It was about restoring faith in the system, about showing that even the most powerful forces could be brought down when the truth was on your side. Judge Matthews looked up from the documents, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room was thick, the tension almost suffocating. Everyone knew that this moment would shape the outcome of the entire trial, and possibly the fate of Hale himself. Mr. Eastwood, Judge Matthews said slowly, breaking the silence, you've presented compelling evidence. But as with any case of this magnitude, the burden of proof lies with the accuser. I will give the defense one last opportunity to respond. After that, we will proceed to closing statements. Clint nodded, his gaze unwavering. He knew this was just the beginning of the end. Hale's defense team would fight back with everything they had, but the truth was undeniable. They had no more moves to make. The defense team, led by a slick, cold-hearted lawyer named Gregory Thorne, stood up, adjusting his tie and glaring at Clint. He knew, deep down, that they were losing. But he couldn't afford to show weakness. He had to throw everything he had into this final push, hoping to salvage whatever he could from the wreckage. Thorne addressed the court, his voice smooth but forced. Your Honor, the documents presented by Mr. Eastwood are speculative at best. They are circumstantial and taken out of context. My client, Mr. Hale, has always acted within the bounds of the law. There is no evidence here that directly links him to any illegal activities. Clint's blood ran cold. The same tired defense. The same attempt to discredit the truth by twisting facts. He was prepared for this, but it still stung. The lies Hale's team had peddled for years had worked for so long that they had become a part of the fabric of society. But Clint wasn't going to let them manipulate the truth any longer. Your Honor, Clint said, his voice calm and controlled but with an underlying force, we've seen the pattern here. The documents I've presented, while inconvenient for Mr. Hale's defense, are factual. They show clear intent. Hale manipulated elections. He controlled media narratives. He bribed politicians. His influence extended far beyond the reaches of Grayson Media. This isn't a case of circumstantial evidence, it's a pattern of behavior. And now, the world knows the truth. The defense team tried to argue, but the damage was done. The court could see the cracks forming in Hale's carefully constructed facade. The truth was leaking through, and there was no stopping it. The following weeks were a blur. The media frenzy surrounding the case had reached a fever pitch. News outlets were reporting non-stop on the trial, with every new revelation stoking the fire of public outrage. The general public, once disillusioned and apathetic, now found themselves drawn into the story. People were talking about the trial everywhere, at work, at coffee shops, in living rooms across the country. This was no longer just a courtroom drama, it was a cultural shift. Clint and his team were working around the clock, preparing for the final stages of the trial. They knew the fight wasn't over yet, but they could see the end in sight. Hale's empire was crumbling, and there was no way he could recover from this. But Clint also knew that the real work would begin after the trial. Holding Hale accountable was only the first step. The system that had allowed someone like Hale to amass such power needed to be overhauled. And Clint was ready for that fight too. It was a rainy afternoon when the final verdict came down. The courthouse was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, and everyone on edge. Clint stood with his team, waiting as the judge prepared to deliver the decision. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, it had only been a few minutes. Judge Matthews entered the courtroom, his expression grim. He took his seat and glanced over at Clint and the defense team before speaking. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented and the arguments made by both parties, the court has reached a verdict, Judge Matthews said, his voice steady. The defendant, Jackson Hale, is found guilty of all charges related to conspiracy, bribery, and corruption. His actions have caused significant harm to the integrity of the media, the government, and the trust of the American people. The words hit like a thunderclap. Clint's heart surged, but he kept his composure. This was the moment they had fought for. Hale was going to pay for his crimes. The system had finally turned against him. Jackson Hale, Judge Matthews continued, will face the maximum sentence for his crimes, including a lengthy prison sentence, restitution to the victims of his actions, and the dismantling of his business empire. The court will also recommend a full investigation into his associates and any other individuals who may have been complicit in his illegal activities. Clint let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. Hale had lost. The weeks that followed were a blur of media interviews, legal proceedings, and the dismantling of Hale's empire. His arrest made headlines around the world, and people were celebrating in the streets. It was a victory for the people. A victory for truth. Clint, though, wasn't interested in basking in the glory. The real work had only just begun. There was still a broken system to fix, and Clint had no intention of stopping here. His phone rang constantly, with calls from reporters, activists, and even government officials who were now seeking his expertise on how to root out corruption in their own organizations. But for Clint, the victory wasn't about fame or accolades, it was about something deeper. It was about righting the wrongs that had been allowed to fester in the dark for so long. It was about showing that, no matter how powerful the enemy, the truth could still prevail. On a quiet evening, Clint sat in his office, staring out the window at the setting sun. Jessica entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one, and they stood together, looking out at the city. "You did it, Clint," Jessica said, her voice filled with pride. "You took down a giant." Clint nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "We did it," he corrected her softly. "Together." And as the sun dipped below the skyline, Clint knew that while the battle had been won, the war was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He had done the right thing, and that was all that mattered. The story of Jackson Hale's downfall would be remembered for years to come, a symbol of the power of truth and the resilience of those who dare to fight against the system. Clint Eastwood, once just a lawyer caught in the shadows of the corrupt, had become a hero, a symbol of hope for all those who believed that justice could still prevail in a world where power often reigned supreme. And as he looked toward the future, Clint knew that this was just the beginning. There was still work to be done, but he was ready for whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?